Hola a todos, estamos acá en una nueva ocasión, en una nueva entrevista. Acá justamente vamos a tratar de analizar con el profesor Yeldan, que está acá invitado, que es de Turquía, y justamente vamos a tratar de analizar lo que es la economía turca. Por ende vamos a ir haciendo un intercambio de distintas preguntas para tratar de entender esta economía tan importante que entiendo que desde toda la región nuestra suele ser bastante desconocida. Así que en función de eso, preparé algunas preguntas para el profesor. How are you, Professor Yeldan? Everything okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for
Best wishes to all.
Thank you for the time with us. Well, the first question. ¿Cómo evalúa la inflación actual de Turquía y la orientación de la política monetaria, incluida la etapa de tasas bajas?
All right. Yeah, no, that works perfect. Excellent. Great. Some of it is beyond Turkey, beyond the Turkish economy. Turkey as part of the global capitalist world, as a peripheral economy. Some of the problems are deep rooted structural problems. First and foremost, inflation, despite all the rhetoric, is not only a simple monetary phenomenon. Inflation is the end result of structural bottlenecks, rigidities, turbulences, and inflation is the end result of real economic problems per se. Pertaining to Turkey, I can distinguish three structural phenomena that Turkish economy is trapped in. Number one is the very high import dependence of the industrial economy. To be able to produce or even to export, Turkish industry needs to import. And this is not only basic materials, fuel oil, natural gas, and basic intermediates, but it ranges from technology, designs, machinery, technological know-how, markets, finance. Without imported strategic inputs, Turkish industry cannot operate. So this import dependence makes the economic scene quite complicated because it is not only the rate of inflation or the rate of central bank's policy interest rate, but the exchange rate, the rate of depreciation, the real value of Turkish lira against foreign currencies come into play and complicate the picture. The second structural problem of the Turkish economy is the deep fragility and income inequality. One of the questions that you have sent to me beforehand. Income inequality is not only a matter of wage labor versus profits of capital, labor versus capital, but it goes beyond that on regional inequality. East of Ankara versus West, the southeastern ethnic problems, gender between women, men, educated women, not well-educated women. So there are a lot of intersectionalities on income inequality that makes the social fabric very fragile and fragmented. Thirdly, Turkish labor markets quite heterogeneous, fragmented, marginalized, organized, educated labor side by side with informal, unorganized labor components living side by side, and labor participation to workforce is structurally very low, especially among women. Women's labor rate of average rate of participation is less than 20% to the workforce. And this is not only explainable by Islamic fundamentalism, religious beliefs, cultural phenomena, because if you look at the comparable countries like Egypt or Indonesia or Tunisia, Turkish women labor participation is comparably low, similar to similar cultural countries. These three structural problems complement each other and produce the inflationary pressures as we witness today. Inflation has a very long history in Turkey, since roughly from 1970s. With the eruption of the first oil shock in 1974, Turkey had started to experience something on the order of 50 to 60% per annum inflation rate for decades, decade after decade, except for brief period from something 2005 to 2020. So except for those brief 10 to 15 years, over the last 50 years, Turkey has been accustomed to what we refer to as moderately high inflation rate on the order of 50 to 60%. Now, this is very unique. Compared to Argentinian experience, for example, there has never been such a long, persistent, moderately high inflation rate. There had been hyperinflation episodes, 200%, 500%. There is a crisis, economy collapses, and then a new balance is constructed. Losers are lost, winners are gained. We continue with a low inflation rate in a new economic environment. But in Turkey, there had been what we refer to as inertia. You believe that next year prices will rise 60%. Everyone believes in it. Everyone signs their contracts accordingly. Labor contracts, contracts on rent, contracts on deposits in your bank. So everyone expects and believes something on the order of 50 to 60%. And it comes to be realized. So expectations are realized and they become entrenched. They become strength. No monetary policy can serve as a remedy to fight against such inertial inflation. It is very rare among economies to have 4-5 decades of persistently high inflation episodes, not going to hyperinflation, not coming down, but it is stuck. So in 1990s, 2000s, the Turkish central bank could do nothing but just to accommodate on what people believed in inflation. It came afterwards, and it is the same story currently. There had been policy mistakes during COVID, post-COVID transitions, the energy shock due to Russia-Ukraine war, geopolitical shocks between Iraq, Syria, and now Iran and Israeli wars and civil wars and disruptions. And people all of a sudden came to realize that the government, the current government, is failing to fight against inflation. There had been policy mistakes on the part of the Erdogan government. Central bank's independence had been severely disrupted. A series of central bank governors had been replaced at will. Not only the central bank governors, but the president of the Turkish Statistics Institute, who was releasing the inflation numbers, the inflation estimates, the president had been sacked. So people came to the notion that the government is replacing objective people with loyal extremists. The official inflation numbers will not be trusted. There is no official anti-inflation program. The government is not following a program as such. So these had built into new expectations. The bottom line is we are at a position where, given those at least 3 structural causes of inflation, these are not monetary problems. Turkish inflation is no longer a monetary problem, and we are trying to fight a structural problem, a problem which is not a monetary problem, with monetary policies, interest rates, organizing campaigns, accusing the big conglomerates. But these are social monetary problems which work only for a very short time. But Turkish inflation is beyond that, unfortunately.
Okay.
Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you. Well, the second question. Desde la teoría de la evidencia internacional, ¿qué políticas son más efectivas para reducir la desigualdad? Bueno, en parte fue respondido.
Touched this subject, as you said briefly. It's a very important problem. As I said, it is not a problem of wages versus profits. This is 19th century classical political economy, wage labor, capital profitability, what we refer to as the functional income inequality. Income inequality has many branches between man, woman, between women, educated with children, uneducated without children, urban versus rural, ethnicity, us versus them. So in such a complicated cultural and social phenomena, social policy towards reducing inequality should have a very focused and very significant fiscal budget. It should supply low-income people with health and education finances. Education and health are the only two public services that middle classes can replenish themselves. They can look after their elderly, they can look after their children, they can educate their children and progress in the income ladder. So it's an expensive project. But what we are confronted with in anti-inflation and austerity programs, a necessity for reducing fiscal expenditures, reducing budget deficits, reducing the size of the government in the economy. So in an attempt towards austerity, government's ability to complement and to follow incomes policies are very limited. The governments cannot run fiscal deficits. Fiscal deficits are bad, but sometimes they are not as bad as they sound. It all depends on where are you spending the government's money. If you are spending your government money in building highways, in building airports, in building big palaces for your president, highways that only rich people drive with their SUVs, airports only used for propaganda, for big, massive projects. These fiscal expenditures have very low rate of return. But fiscal expenditures on mass education, mass health are very effective in reducing inequality. So I will say that reducing inequality in all these areas require policy space, fiscal intervention, which is very much under siege, very much oppressed by the austerity concerns of anti-inflation. As I said, inflation is not a monetary problem. It has a social dimension, and that's how we should attack both inequality and inflation through these policies. It is not easy, it's complicated, but going through stubborn neoliberal austerity measures are making the problem even worse.
La tercera pregunta entonces, ¿qué combinación de medidas considera más eficaz para bajar la inflación de forma sustentable?
As I've been hinting, one of the sources of inflation is entrenched, inertial, sustained expectations. People do not believe that the government is running an anti-inflation problem. Fiscal expenditures on government's luxury items, on massive armaments, on massive road construction projects, on big infrastructure projects with no rate of return at all. Corruption, mismanagement, these are the things that make the ordinary people to believe that inflation is not being fought for. So one strong anti-inflationary program will be sustaining people's living standard through fiscal aid, not necessarily through minimum wages or putting floors against higher wage demands, but to help people sustain their living so that they realize that even though the prices are increasing in inflation, they have the basic income coming from the government aid so that they realize that the inflation expectation spiral is broken down. Then you can introduce orthodox, classical anti-inflation measures, interest rates, exchange rate management, credit management, trying to cool down the economy. But first and foremost, you have to capture people's minds that they are protected by the state against inflation. This is very much in contrast to the Argentinian story, which I hope we are going to come to.
¿Cómo deberían adaptarse las políticas de empleo ante la automatización y la economía digital?
This is beyond Turkey as well. And this is a universal, global problem now. And definitely putting penalties putting constraints against automation or digital economy or advances in technology is not the answer. That has never been the correct way of dealing with technological advances. From Luddite movement back in Liverpool, in the UK during the Industrial Revolution times, not in France, not in Germany, not in China or anywhere. Scientific technological advances will always cause social disruptions. So it is the society's role how to adapt new institutions to protect people, to protect the losers of new technological advances, and to help people get ready for the new scientific technological advance. Unfortunately, I must say that even at the expense of generalization, most of the problems lie in the fact that we are dealing with a new technological advance with institutions of the 20th century, backward institutions. The new social policy objectives should be aligned. Things like basic incomes, things like taxing the rich, taxing rents, high financial gains, speculative gains. In the Turkish context, the construction rents, the land rents, which is untaxed, which is speculative rents, taxing the upper 1% of income strata to help the lower 50% of the people. So through progressive taxation, you have to introduce income support programs against those unemployed structurally with automation and digital economy. The problems rose not because those people are unemployed, but they are unemployed and they don't have any options. So we have to first help them to live, survive, and then help them to re-educate themselves given the new requirements of an AI-driven digitalized economy. Our institutions have not developed yet. Institutions based on social welfare state, based on cultural propaganda, what I will say from the Cold War era, those do not help the 21st century problems.
¿La gran inversión en infraestructura es un pilar de competitividad a largo plazo para Turquía?
That's a very important question, but I have to comment on this. By large-scale infrastructure investment, I believe that you are referring to housing constructions.
Housing and infrastructure in airports, ports.
Exactly. You see, since roughly after 2009 global crisis, after 2010, Turkey has initiated big mega infrastructure projects. The largest airport in Europe, the fourth largest in the world, in Istanbul. One of the longest bridges, again, close to Istanbul highway infrastructure, one of the longest bridges combining two sides of a gulf nearby Istanbul. In almost every city in Turkey, middle-sized city now has an airport. There is not much of a demand, only one or two planes land per day, but the airport is there. It's kind of a magnificent cultural display of the big new Turkey. A lot of hospital buildings, state hospitals, but only buildings, without doctors, without nurses, without medical equipment. Beds are there, but they are not being serviced because they are terribly lacking personnel. We have emergency centers with no doctors, but high-rise apartments, big, fancy hospital buildings. They're on display. And then a housing boom. Istanbul is now a construction center. It's like the China in late 1980s. 50th floor apartments just mushrooming everywhere on potato farms. And this, of course, one by itself, it is a one-time injection of money into the economy. It doesn't create connected demand. You do it, it is finished, it is done. It's not serving, as I said. Two, they are very import intensive. Technology, machinery, natural gas, fuel oil, they are all adding to the import bill, creating a very strong trade deficit and leading to currency depreciation for the economy. So benefits are only once. Expenditures are in foreign currency, in euros, in US dollars, depleting the foreign reserves, and all leading to inflationary pressures. And as I've been saying, people see this. People see that the central bank is playing around with its interest rate, but then there are those massive expenditures on only for display projects, which are not serving to the people, and they are monumental, huge displays of luxury, adding a lot of expenditures and costs to the state budget. So in terms of competitiveness, it is to the contrary. It is eroding Turkish industry. It is diverting incentives away from productive agriculture and industry to speculative finance and rent seeking. And as such, it leads to high inflation with low employment content and with a very high budget and international trade deficit. But it is very lucrative. It goes to the conglomerates, big companies close to the government. They are earning a lot of money through this. Income distribution is getting worse. Very lucrative, very easy wealth seeking.
Yes, one additional question. In the Turkish USD denominate public debt to GDP ratio is relatively low, no?
It is relatively low, but it is mostly in short-term debt. That's the problem. And it is relatively low because the Turkish income is in Turkish lira, debt is in foreign US dollars. So the exchange rate is a bad translator in that respect. When there is a devaluation, all of a sudden the currency crisis may pop up. That's what happened in 2001 and 2009.
Okay, thank you. ¿Cómo evolucionó el salario mínimo en los últimos años en términos reales?
Hard to tell. The reason is to be able to calculate any real income, minimum wage or any wage income, you have to have a trustworthy, correct estimate of what the inflation rate is. And it is not only a matter of official mismanagement. But inflation has now so many different dynamics. For example, we have done a study looking at different income groups. The poorest 10%. Food, housing is the most important items in their own budget. And looking at the food inflation and housing costs, heating the house, cooling the house, running the house, they are around 75 to 80% per annum in comparison to an official inflation rate, which is an average of everything, average of everyone, of 85 million people, thousands of goods and services. The inflation rate is about 35%, but the lowest, poorest 10% is experiencing an inflation of 75%. Then you go to the upper richest 10%. Education expenditures for their children. They are having an education inflation of 130% inflation rate per annum. So different people consuming different products have wildly different inflation rates, and they are stuck in their minds. So for that reason, nobody believes the adjustments on the minimum wage. It is always coming after very late. Minimum wage compared to an official inflation rate of 35% seems to be sufficiently high. But in real income of the people who are confronting with 75% food price rises, 120% health and education expenditures, rents, they have almost tripled in the last year. People who do not own house and they have to rent a house, they are experiencing a very rapid inflation rate. So the adjustments in the minimum wage does not compensate. So it's very hard, but calculations based on different income levels of different people give that not only the minimum wage, but any wage income is not sufficient in an inflationary environment. And that's very normal. That's what happens when you have 50% of an inflation rate and people are scattered around it.
Okay, thank you. ¿Cuáles son las prioridades de política industrial actual y qué ajustes pone a futuro?
Again, at the expense of sounding too optimistic and generalizing, a very important component of new industrial policy right now is based on renewables, green economy, green transitions, based on new sources of energy, where Turkey has a lot of advantage with wind and sun in particular. Turkish Industry is heavily concentrated in the west, in Istanbul area or in Izmir and to the west of Ankara. The country is what we refer to as Belindia. It's a Latin American economist description. Belgium embedded in a huge India with very low rates of growth, highly populated, low employment, low health, low education. This is the classical duality, fragmented policy framework. Industry has to be moved to the east. And it doesn't have to be rocket science. It can be agriculture-based industries based on renewable sources of energy, organic agriculture, food, processed food, local industries, wherever comparative advantage lies. And this is not something to be achievable by giving only employment incentives, investment incentives, tax incentives, subsidies. It doesn't work. You have to provide logical services. You have to provide a demand, a regional demand for regional industry. Almost all economic activity is very densely centralized at the expense of a huge, massive unemployed land. So the industrial policy should be designed to reduce regional inequalities with the state leading the role. There is a leading role for the government to invite in the private sector with joint programs, joint incentives, joint investment ventures. It's not working to say that I am going to give you tax breaks or subsidize your investments. You go ahead and do it. That doesn't lead to any good cause. So public-driven industrial policy based on regional motives should be the priority.
Okay, thank you. ¿De qué manera los conflictos regionales impactan en la economía turca?
Terribly important. We have been referring to this problem. Eastern Turkey, sharing a border with Iran, with Syria, lots of ethnic violence, lots of ethnic divisions, a lot of regional conflicts inflated by ethnical problems, and problems create other problems. Conflicts create unemployment, unemployment creates terrorism, and this is a vicious circle. As you asked in your previous question, the new industrial policy should go hand in hand with a regional incomes policy, bringing security and public services to those people in the region.
Okay. ¿Qué rol debe cumplir el Estado en la economía según usted?
The state should be active and it should also be subject to democratic control. Checks and balances. Turkish state has taken a role where to speed up things. Now the president and the current government does not have any democratic control. They take their decisions given the belief that you need very quick decisions to make. But to make quick decisions, now there are a lot of undemocratic authoritarian moves, and that's not the way to do it. With active role, democratically controlled by constitution court, by the universities, by local litigation. But it's not true that the state should move outside the economy and let the markets run by itself. That doesn't work in a peripheral economy like Turkey. On the other hand, involvement without any democratic control is also leading to corruption and mismanagement of the economy as well.
Thank you. La última pregunta. ¿Cómo está viendo la experiencia argentina y cree que es posible un liberalismo en extremo que pueda generar prosperidad?
It is hard to tell, but on the other hand, as you all know, Argentina is not going through extreme liberalism, as you put it, for the first time. Under Menem 1990-1991, the convertibility board regime, $1, 1 peso style experiments had been conducted. And back in 1990-1991, like today, inflation came down from hyperinflation all the way to 1%, 2% significantly. But it didn't stay there. It created a lot of unemployment, a lot of income problems, because it was a shock therapy, not protecting the people who are losing their jobs, current account deficit, the trade deficit running out of hand because the exchange rate was fixed. So right now, with an extreme liberalization, with the extreme reduction of the state's role, my fear is that it will lead to corruption. It will lead to luxurious consumption, high income inequality, with people marginalized, informalized, losing their jobs on the one hand, people who have access to finance, access to foreign markets, they are being very much protected, and the social tensions will gather. So in the immediate short run, it's not the first time that Argentina is reducing its inflation and bringing austerity, but at a very, very high social cost, which back in the 1990s had erupted in the 2001 crisis because the economy could not come into balances on its own. So my fear is that this extreme reduction in the state's role, leading to authoritarian conduct of the economy with structural unemployment, may lead to severe social problems in the medium to longer run. Hoping that I will be mistaken, but that had been our common history. And before you ask any further questions or anything, let me share this piece of information. In Turkey, Turkish economy, the professionals of the Turkish economy typically refer to Turkish economy as a Latin American economy, along with Argentina and Brazil and Turkey. And the fourth Latin American country is the Philippines. So these are four Latin American countries: football, samba, belly dancing, strong army, culturally high-blooded people, and a lot of experiments in these sorts. So we have a lot of common cultural, economic cultural phenomena, very long state involvement, very long import substitutionism, very long closed economy. The balance between Peronism and the pre-liberal regimes just going up and down at each round with a severe crisis transformation. So this is not a different history. We are going through the same episodes: high inflation, high state involvement, a lot of corruption, I must say, and mismanagement.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yeldan. I make a short close for the video.
Of course, of course.
Bueno, espero que te haya gustado el video que hicimos hoy sobre la economía turca. Si te gustó, desde ya le puedes dar me gusta, puedes compartir el video, puedes comentar lo que te parezca que pueda agregar información y demás. Y desde ya acordate siempre de suscribirte. Muchas gracias y hasta luego.